It was supposed to be my dream home, my private sanctuary, but it turned into a war zone the day HOA President Brenda looked at my family's century-old fishing lake and called it community property. It started with polite notes, then escalated to screaming confrontations on my lawn. But I didn't fight back with shouts. I fought back with the one thing she never expected, her own rule book. I found a clause, buried so deep no one ever read it. A clause that didn't just let me win an argument. It let me exile her entire family from the one thing they loved most. What happened next was the most brutally satisfying moment of my life. My wife Sarah and I had spent years searching for the perfect place to put down roots. We didn't just want a house, we wanted a legacy. When we found the property on Willow Creek Road, it felt like destiny. The house itself was charming, but it was the land that stole our hearts. Tucked away behind a grove of ancient oaks was a sparkling 7-acre lake, a place of profound peace that had been in my family for 3 generations. This wasn't just any lake. My grandfather taught me to fish on its quiet shores, and my father taught me about stewardship. We'd always maintained it, protected its ecosystem, and considered it our family's most sacred heirloom. The property lines, clearly defined in the deed, included the house, the surrounding woods, and the entire lake. It was private, it was ours, and it was the reason we drained our savings to secure this future for our kids. The community, Pinecrest Estates, seemed idyllic. The HOA, led by a woman named Brenda, was presented as low-key, mainly handling the upkeep of the common flower beds at the entrance. Brenda, with her perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, welcomed us with a binder of rules. "We just like to keep things looking neat for everyone," she'd said. It seemed reasonable at the time. The first few months were paradise. Our kids learned to swim in the clear water, and weekend barbecues by the lake became our new tradition. We were living the dream we'd worked so hard for. But that dream was built on a foundation I didn't yet realize was fragile. Because in that thick binder of HOA rules, a single ambiguously worded clause was sleeping like a dormant volcano. And Brenda, who loved control more than she loved community, was about to wake it up. It all started with a single friendly email. Brenda had noticed my nephew fishing with us over the weekend. She gently reminded me that the community's shared water features had certain guidelines for guest usage. I remember staring at that phrase, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Shared water features. She wasn't talking about the tiny decorative pond at the entrance. She was talking about my lake, and that's when I knew our paradise was about to be tested. That first email was the crack in the dam. I replied politely but firmly, attaching the relevant section of my property deed that outlined the lake's boundaries and my sole ownership. I assumed it was a simple misunderstanding, easily cleared up with a legal document. I was wrong. Brenda's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic passive aggression. She didn't challenge the deed. Instead, she pivoted. She wrote back, "While the land may be deeded to your lot, the body of water itself is governed by a 1985 covenant concerning community-shared natural resources for the benefit and enjoyment of all residents." It was a loophole I never saw coming. She wasn't claiming to own the land under the lake. She was claiming the HOA had the right to regulate the water and, by extension, its usage. The harassment began in earnest. It started with a formal typed letter slid into our mailbox. It stated that our unauthorized private use of a community resource was a violation. The fine was $250. I was furious. I marched down to the HOA's small office, the letter crumpled in my fist. Brenda sat behind her desk, calm and collected. "It's not about the money. It's about the principle," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "All residents should be able to enjoy the lake's beauty. It's only fair, but they can't access it," I argued, my voice rising. "It's surrounded by my private property. The only way to get to it is by trespassing through my backyard." She gave me that thin, cold smile. "Then perhaps you should grant the association an easement. For the community's benefit, of course." And there it was. The true goal, it was never about her guests fishing. It was about control. She wanted to turn my family's legacy into a public park, with her as the gatekeeper. I refused. The fine went unpaid. A week later, another letter arrived. The fine was now $500 for continued non-compliance. Attached was a new rule, freshly voted on by the HOA board, which consisted of Brenda and her two closest friends. It stated that, to ensure equitable access, no single household could have more than 2 guests at the shared water feature at any time. My son's birthday party with his 3 cousins visiting had just been outlawed. The sense of siege was absolute. We felt like prisoners on our own property. Brenda, or one of her loyal neighbors, would often walk right up to our property line, sometimes with a notepad, pretending to inspect trees or fences. But their eyes were always on the lake, on us. We stopped having friends over. Every laugh from our backyard felt like a rebellion. The pressure was taking a toll. Sarah and I were arguing, stressed about the money and the legal threat. The kids could feel the tension. Our sanctuary had become a source of constant anxiety. I decided to fight fire with fire. I started reading the HOA covenants and bylaws myself. The document was a nightmare of legalese and vague language, but I was motivated. I spent every night after work poring over it, looking for anything I could use. I found a rule about architectural consistency and used it to challenge the hideous pink flamingo she'd let her friend install in their front yard. Her fury was palpable. The retaliation was swift and brutal. The next morning, I found a notice on my door. A $1,000 fine for an unapproved structure. I was confused until I followed the inspector's gaze to the old, weathered wooden dock my grandfather had built decades ago. The dock that was the very heart of our lake memories. They demanded I tear it down. I was shaking with rage. This was no longer about rules. It was a personal vendetta. She was trying to erase my family's history out of sheer spite. I hired a lawyer. The first consultation was sobering. He confirmed the deed was rock solid, but he also warned me about the shared resource clause Brenda was clinging to. "It's flimsy," he said, "but fighting it in court could cost you $50,000, maybe more." HOAs have deep pockets for this kind of thing. I felt trapped. I was right, but being right was bankrupting us. The legal letters started flying, each one costing me hundreds of dollars. Brenda, using HOA funds, had no such concern. The conflict came to a head on a Saturday afternoon. I was teaching my daughter how to cast a line from the dock when I heard a voice. "Violation. Unpermitted guest activity." It was Brenda, standing at the very edge of my property line with a man I didn't recognize, pointing at my 6-year-old daughter. My blood went cold. She had brought a potential buyer to look at the house across the street and was using my family as a showcase of her power. Something in me snapped. The years of stress, the fines, the threats to my home, the look of fear on my daughter's face, it all coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. I walked up the slope to where they stood. "Get off my property," I said, my voice dangerously low. "We're on the common easement," she smirked, not moving an inch. I was done playing her game. I looked her dead in the eye. "Brenda, you are so obsessed with the rules. You love them so much. You've built your entire little kingdom on them." I took a step closer. "Well, I've been reading them. Every single one. And I found something I think you're going to find very, very interesting. It's a rule you wrote yourself." Her smirk faltered for just a second. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked back to my daughter, leaving her standing there. The war of letters and fines was over. I was about to use her own weapon to launch a nuclear strike. And the terrifying part was she had no idea what was coming. The annual Pinecrest Estates HOA meeting was held in the sterile community clubhouse. It was normally a sparsely attended affair, just Brenda and her inner circle rubber stamping their own ideas. But this year was different. This year I was there, sitting in the front row with my wife, a single slim folder on my lap. The air was thick with tension. Brenda, seated at the head table, avoided my gaze, her posture rigid. She began the meeting with her usual reports, her voice dripping with faux cheerfulness. She spoke of flowerbed maintenance, streetlight efficiency, and then, her tone hardening, of the critical importance of upholding our community's covenants. Even when it's difficult, all eyes flickered to me. This was my public shaming, the final act in her campaign to break me. Then she opened the floor for new business. I didn't raise my hand. I simply stood up. "Brenda," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the quiet room. "I have a point of order regarding covenant enforcement." She sighed, as if dealing with a tiresome child. We've been over this, dear. The lake is a shared resource. The fines and the rules stand. If you have a grievance, file it in writing. Oh, this isn't about the lake, I said, opening the folder. A hush fell over the room. This is about a different rule, one you seem to have forgotten. Specifically, Article 14, Section 3, the Good Neighbor Bylaw. I saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She didn't know where I was going. Nobody did. I read the clause aloud, my voice echoing in the silent room. It states, and I quote, "No resident shall engage in a persistent pattern of behavior that creates a nuisance, diminishes property values, or fosters a hostile living environment for their neighbors. Violation of this bylaw is grounds for the suspension of all community privileges, including but not limited to the use of common areas and voting rights." Brenda scoffed. "This is ridiculous. I am the one enforcing the rules, not breaking them." "Are you?" I asked, meeting her gaze. I then pulled out a stack of papers. "This is a log I've kept. 42 separate instances over the last 6 months of you, Brenda, trespassing on my property line to harass my family. Here are the photos of you and your associates standing there, watching us, intimidating my children. I have sworn statements from 3 other families on Willow Creek Road who you've similarly harassed over minor infractions, who were too afraid to speak up until now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was news to them. "But that's not the nuisance," I continued, my voice growing louder. "The nuisance is the frivolous fines. The nuisance is the constant threatening letters. The nuisance is you using HOA funds to wage a personal war against me, draining our community's resources for a lawsuit over a lake you have no legal right to, all because I challenged you on a pink flamingo." People were staring at her, their expressions shifting from passive acceptance to dawning realization. "And as for diminishing property values?" I paused, letting the tension peak. I pulled out the final document from my folder. This is a letter from a real estate agent. He states unequivocally that the public knowledge of our HOA's aggressive and litigious nature has made several potential buyers withdraw their offers on houses in Pinecrest. He calls it a significant liability and a red flag for the entire neighborhood. Your actions, Brenda, are actively making everyone's homes worth less money. The room erupted. That was the one thing that got through to everyone. Their investment was at risk. Brenda was on her feet, her face a mask of fury. "This is slander." "You have no proof. Those documents are forgeries." "I have it all notarized," I said calmly. "And according to the same bylaws you love so much, a petition signed by 1/3 of the homeowners can force a vote for the immediate removal of any board member found in violation of the covenants." I turned to face the stunned residents. "I have that petition right here. I suggest you all think very carefully about who is truly creating a hostile environment. Who is the real nuisance in Pinecrest Estates?" For a moment, there was dead silence. Then, Mr. Henderson, a quiet, elderly man who had lived here for 20 years, stood up. He walked to the front, took the pen from my hand, and signed the petition. One by one, others followed. A line formed. They weren't just doing it for me. They were doing it for themselves, finally freed from the fear she instilled. Brenda watched, her face pale, her kingdom crumbling before her eyes. She had hidden behind the rules for so long, she never considered they could be used to build a prison just for her. The vote was unanimous. Brenda was removed from the HOA board, effective immediately. As the meeting adjourned and people shuffled out, shaking my hand, Brenda stood frozen at the head table, gathering her things with trembling hands. She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a venomous hate. She opened her mouth, but I spoke first, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the now empty room. "You called it community property," I said. "So I used the community's rules. Now you're banned from it." I turned and walked out into the night, the weight of the last year finally lifting from my shoulders. The war was over. But the aftermath was just beginning. Walking out of that clubhouse felt like stepping into a new world. The air itself seemed cleaner, lighter. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening with tears of relief, and in that moment, I knew we had not just won a battle. We had reclaimed our lives. The silent car ride home was the most peaceful we'd experienced in over a year. For the first time when we pulled into our driveway, we weren't scanning the property line for Brenda. We were just coming home. The fallout was swift and profound. With Brenda's immediate removal, the remaining board members, who had largely been her puppets, were terrified of facing a similar revolt. An emergency board was formed, and I was unanimously elected the new HOA president. My first act wasn't one of revenge, but of reform. I immediately rescinded every single frivolous fine Brenda had levied, not just against us, but against every homeowner in Pinecrest. The checks we mailed out were more than just refunds. They were an apology and a promise. My second act was to formally and legally dismantle her entire argument. We held a special community vote to amend the covenants. The ambiguous shared natural resources clause was ripped out and replaced with crystal-clear language. Private property, as defined by recorded deeds, is sacrosanct. The HOA shall have no jurisdiction over the usage, access, or enjoyment of privately owned land or water bodies. We voted to sunset dozens of her most petty rules, from the regulation of garden gnomes to the mandated shade of beige for mailboxes. The oppressive cloud that had hung over Pinecrest Estates simply evaporated. But what about Brenda? The consequences for her were more fitting than any fine I could have imagined. The good neighbor bylaw violation stood. She was officially deemed a nuisance, and her voting rights were suspended for 1 year. But the real punishment was social. The neighborhood, once cowed by her, now saw her for what she was, a bully who had been disarmed. The families she had terrorized for years no longer crossed the street to avoid her. They met her gaze with cold indifference. Her authority, which was the source of her identity, had vanished overnight. About 6 months after the meeting, a for-sale sign appeared on her lawn. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final words. She just gave up. She had tried to control our little slice of paradise so completely that she made it uninhabitable for herself. The day the moving truck came was a quiet, sunny afternoon. I was on my dock, fishing with my son, and we watched it all from a distance. There was no sense of gloating, just a profound, quiet closure. She wasn't chased out by a mob. She was simply erased by the collective will of a community she had failed to break. The new family that bought her house is lovely. They have 2 young kids who sometimes wave to us from their backyard. We've even invited them over to fish a few times on our terms as neighbors, not as a mandated community. The lake has returned to what it always should have been, a place of laughter, of peace, and of legacy. The long-term impact of that struggle is etched into the fabric of our family and our neighborhood. My kids, who had grown anxious from the constant conflict, slowly regained their carefree spirits. The deep, stressful lines on Sarah's face softened, replaced by the easy smile I fell in love with. Our home was ours again, not just in deed, but in spirit. The community, liberated from Brenda's micromanaging, actually became more neighborly. People started having block parties again. They felt empowered to personalize their homes, to plant vibrant gardens without fear of a violation notice. By tearing down the tyranny of petty rules, we built a stronger, more genuine community. So what's the takeaway from all of this? It's not that all HOAs are evil. They exist for a reason. The takeaway is this: no one, not an HOA president, not a noisy neighbor, not anyone, has the right to steal your peace. They operate on a simple principle, that most people are too busy, too tired, or too afraid to fight back. They count on your compliance. Brenda never expected me to read every single word of that rule book. She never expected me to fight back with her own weapon. But when you do, when you stand your ground not with screaming matches, but with cold, hard facts and an unwavering resolve, their power crumbles. It's not easy. It's stressful and expensive, and it will test you in ways you can't imagine. But your home is your castle. It is your sanctuary. It is the legacy you build for your family. Is yours worth fighting for? I know mine was. And as I sit here on my dock, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange, listening to my kids' laughter echo across the water that my grandfather taught me to love, I know with absolute certainty that every single moment of that fight was worth it.